Hey guys, it's Krista Watson with Krista Quilts, and today I'm going to show you how to quilt the continuous spiral. This is a wonderful walking foot design that I've quilted on my Sparkling Stars quilt and also my Optical Illusion, and it would work great on any quilt you choose. First, you want to practice on a sample. Grab a couple of leftover squares of fabric and some batting and use something to draw a circle template. I'm using a spool of thread with a washable marking pen. You want to draw your circle first in the middle of where you're going to start quilting. Then you want to draw a little guideline, which is roughly the distance between the needle and the edge of your foot. My foot is about 3/8 of an inch, but yours may vary. After you draw this guideline, you want to very carefully sketch your beginning curve, and I'm using my spool of thread to make a nice smooth curve that creates the start of my spiral. Feel free to take a few seconds to draw this out and sketch yourself a nice smooth curve. I'm going to draw a little X, and this is going to be my starting point where I'm going to bring my needle up. This is where the circle and the line intersect. Next, bring the bobbin thread up to the top, and you can wait and tie that off later on. Once you've grabbed that little loop of bobbin, pull it out of the way and you can start stitching. You can either tie off your thread in a little while or you can lock your stitches. The choice is up to you. Start in the little intersection where the circle and the beginning of the tail overlap and very carefully and slowly start stitching. We're going to stitch all the way around the circle, and I'm going to show you this in actual real time. I want to show you how I quilt this entire sample, so it'll be a little bit slow in the beginning, but I'll speed it up for the rest of the video. Notice some things that are going on while I'm stitching. My hands are gently moving the fabric, and I'm only taking a couple of stitches before I stop and rotate. Now, depending on your machine, you might have a knee lift feature, or you might have to lift up your foot every stitch or so. What I'm doing on my Bernina, I actually have what's called the hover feature. The hover allows the foot to pop up whenever I stop stitching. That's a machine setting. As I'm stitching this very beginning of the spiral, this is going to take a long time, but the rest of it goes much quicker. I'm showing you this in black thread so that you can see my stitching, but in reality, I would actually stitch with a more blending thread so that you don't see all the wobbles and bobbles. I will continue to stitch very, very slowly in the very beginning of this design. Trust me, it picks up later and it goes a lot faster. But if you go very slow in the beginning, you can get a nice, smoother curve. Again, because I'm using high contrast, you're going to see all of my little mistakes, but once you get further away from the quilt, it won't be noticeable at all. Once I cross over my previous starting path, I'm going to start stitching on that little tail that I drew. And the important thing to think about is that the left side of my foot is going to hug that curve as I stitch around. 1 or 2 stitches at a time, stop, rotate, and keep on going. When I hit that line, that straight line, somewhere around there, I'm going to stop stitching following the line, and now I'm going to use the edge of my foot as a guideline. If you look on your foot, you can maybe find a little bump or a little spot on your foot that you want to keep hugging that curve. I've got a little bump on my little foot that I just indicated with the scissors, and so I'm going to turn as much as possible to keep that little indentation on the foot hugging that curve the entire time. Again, this is very slow and very tedious in the beginning, but once you get the hang of it, it really goes a lot faster. As I continue to slowly stitch around the center spiral, I'll share a couple more tips with you. So I'm actually using a Bernina 770 machine with an integrated dual feed system. What this is it acts very much like a walking foot in that the upper foot is stitching through at the same rate as the feed dogs underneath. There's a mechanism that attaches to the back of my dual feed foot that makes it act just like a walking foot, and I don't get any puckers. As I come around the end, I'm continuing to get that little starting tail out of my way. I trimmed it off. If you don't want to tie off your threads in the beginning or the end, you can just stitch back and forth, or in place to lock those threads. It's going to be a little more noticeable, but the choice is up to you. I'm going to continue to stitch around a little bit more, and then I'll speed it up for you. But the important thing is you want to continue to hug that curve with the edge of your foot, and the wider you go and the further out you go, the faster you can get. Continue to hug the curve, and I'm ignoring that line. I'll wash that off later when I get to it, when I'm all finished. Now the width of the lines that you are stitching is going to be completely dependent on the edge of your foot. If you have a smaller foot or a walking foot with a very narrow foot, you might have 1/4 inch lines. If you have a wider foot, you might have 1/2 inch lines. You can always add a guide bar to your foot if you want to make your lines wider. Mine is about 3/8 of an inch, and as long as I'm consistent, it's going to look great. Now that we know what we're doing, I'm going to go ahead and speed up this video so that I can get through this faster. But remember, I'm still stitching very slowly like I did in the beginning. Once you have a little bit more control, you can move it around. But because I have the hover feature engaged, it looks like I'm hardly moving everything. But in reality, I'm stitching, moving my fingers, stitching, and I'm continuing to go all the way around. I will stitch all the way around the spiral until I stitch off the end of the fabric. If your stitching happens to get a little wobbly or a little wavy while you go, don't worry about it at all. By the time you pull it off the machine, no one will notice your imperfections but you. You can decide to stop the spiral at any time by tapering off and locking your stitches at the end, or you can do what I'm doing, where I'm going to keep stitching until I run out of fabric. Once I stitch completely off the edge, then I'll show you how I'm going to finish those corners. I'll continue stitching in the batting even if it's sticking out a little bit beyond the quilt. Once I get to the end, I'm going to cut my thread and I'm going to echo those corners. Notice as I echo each line, I start stitching and I come off the batting and cut thread. Rather than going back and forth, which can cause puckers on your quilt, I'm stitching the lines in one direction every single time. So if I have 4 corners, I'm going to echo each corner to finish off this design. To tie off my thread when I'm done stitching, I'm going to grab 2 threads. It's the top and the bobbin that I've pulled up to the top. I'm going to tie a little knot by hand and make sure that the knot is almost touching the quilt but sticking up just a tiny bit. Next, I'm going to take a needle that has a hole in the end. I call this a cheater needle. I'm going to thread the end of that needle and then push it right back through where I stopped stitching. This is going to go through the top and the batting, and I'm going to use a thimble to help me push the needle through to the other side. You can hear a little pop once you pull it through, and then you can cut off the extra thread so that nothing is sticking out. Now this is again more noticeable because I'm using a darker thread, so I'm kind of massaging that little end back into the quilt, and again, if you're using a matching thread color, you're not going to see it at all. I use a water bottle to squirt the blue lines so that they will disappear. If they come back later, make sure you wash it thoroughly. Trim it up and you're ready to quilt your real quilt. When you quilt with a contrasting thread, you can really see every wobble and bobble. However, if you want your thread to blend in, use a matching thread and all you see is the beautiful texture rather than the imperfections. But either one you choose is up to you. If you'd like to quilt multiple spirals, you can quilt one as long as you like, finish it, and then add another spiral that overlaps until you finish the entire quilt. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Please see more at KristaQuilts.com and share your work in my Facebook group.